Cool. So, hello everyone, and welcome to the first ever Hedgehog webinar. The topic is how might ChatGPT affect SEO? Over the last few months, I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of you, my clients, and just other friends and colleagues about ChatGPT. And the questions have consistently come up in those conversations about what is going on. There's a lot of buzz, excitement, thrill about ChatGPT, and also some concern about how it might affect SEO as a landscape going forward. It's been enough interest to actually bring me from content creation retirement. So I don't generally produce a lot of content for various reasons, including that I'm usually just focusing all of my time and attention on my clients and their results. So don't really have much time to produce content myself. But this topic was both interesting enough and had enough interest for me personally and enough curiosity from others that I decided to produce this webinar presentation. So just for everyone who's live, this is being recorded. So if you ask any questions, those questions will show up on the recording as well. But feel free to interrupt, and at certain points... Oh, we just have another person joining. Hi, Jaken. We just kicked off. We're just doing the introduction. You haven't missed much.
Thanks, mate.
Cool. So I was just sort of introducing that there's been a lot of interest about this topic, and it's brought me back from content creation retirement. So I don't generally produce a lot of content for various reasons, but I'm just coming back to produce this one. I was just having a casual chat with Elma, who's also on the call, and we're saying, well, in future, ChatGPT might produce all of the content. So this might be the last time I produce content anyway. So there's been a lot of buzz, interest, and excitement about ChatGPT, and I'm very excited to present some of the ideas that I've been building around this to you. So here's the agenda for the webinar. First, we'll start with a brief introduction or a primer on large language models. So what ChatGPT and other large language models are, and where they appear to be going and why they're receiving so much attention recently. Then we'll be doing a bit of an introduction about how we can predict or how we can speculate about what's going to happen in SEO when ChatGPT gets more integrated. So some of the topics that we'll be touching on during the course of that is the effect on the search landscape. So SERP stands for search engine result pages. So we'll be talking about like what effects that chat will have on that, user experience as well. We'll be talking about content creation and strategy. We'll also be talking about consent and endorsement and a bunch of other considerations. So very excited to get going. Do feel free to interrupt with any questions as we go along. So here's just a brief primer on large language models, or LLMs. So ChatGPT is an LLM, and it's an artificial intelligence. And in brief, this is kind of how it works. It's like a very smart computer that has swallowed the textbooks, all of the textbooks. And so when you ask it a question, it answers from the textbooks that it swallowed. So it has what's called a training data set behind it, which is just a whole bunch of data that the people who designed it put together. People are very, very careful in curating training data sets to make sure that it has good quality information. It includes things like books, just tons of books and articles and so on. Then this large language model sits here on top of the training data set, and then you have a user interface, which is your chat. And the interaction is you ask it a question and it streams the answer from the data set by predicting the next word in a sentence. So how that works on a technical level is beyond me. I find it very curious and fascinating that the way that they invented this is by streaming. It's almost like a very sophisticated auto-predict. So you ask it a question and then it almost like it auto-predicts the answer from what the training data set is, how people used language in the training data set. So there are currently a few large language models in the market, and this is a very, very emerging space. As of the 30th of November 2022, ChatGPT was launched. As of April 2023, ChatGPT apparently has 100 million users and 1 billion visitors per month. That is very, very impressive. I'll show you in a slide in the next one. But for context, Google has 4.3 billion users and 8.5 billion searchers per day. So it's still very, very far behind Google, but Google is massive. And it still is very, very impressive. So ChatGPT is the main one. I think it's called ChatGPT 3. There's a newer version which is more sophisticated called ChatGPT or GPT-4, which will be integrated into Bing Chat. And in fact, you can already use it today. You just have to join on Bing and go to the waiting list and then say that you would like to use it. I already have access to this, and a lot of other people do. Google has their competing product Bard. Google has been slightly embarrassed to release a version that's not as good as Bing's for once. This is an instance where Bing really has the edge. And they also have a waiting list, and Bard is not available in Australia yet. It's only available in the US and potentially some other countries. ChatGPT is huge. ChatGPT is actually the fastest growing consumer application in history. So it was launched in, as we said, in November 2022, and now it has 100 million active users. It grew faster than Facebook, faster than TikTok, faster than Instagram, and faster than Google itself. So this is very, very significant that it's here, and I think it's definitely worth us paying close attention to. ChatGPT and large language models are great. I don't know if any of you have played with them. I'm sure you have by now, but they are absolutely amazing. I spent many an hour already chatting with ChatGPT, asking all sorts of questions. I've found it very useful to answer all sorts of questions, and it really is a lot of the questions that I ask it, I might have gone to Google for in the past and might have spent time reading. Now, it's not perfect. It has some very interesting weaknesses. The first is called hallucination. So hallucination is when it just makes up answers that aren't true, but it makes them up with a high confidence interval. So like, whereas we humans, if I ask you a question, you might just say, I don't know, and you have that self-awareness. Unfortunately, ChatGPT doesn't. And so when you ask it any question, it just kind of throws out answers, and some of those answers are just way, way, way off. It's also not great at maths, not that that matters much because we use other tools for that. And it also has some guardrail issues. So guardrails are things installed into large language models that make them avoid really egregious mistakes. For example, telling you to do something dangerous or being racist, etc. But those guardrail issues can result in really bad answers. So one example I've heard of is that, at least in an earlier version of ChatGPT, they asked it, what religion would the first Jewish president of the United States be? And so the answer is obviously Jewish, but because it was programmed to avoid any sort of seemingly racist or judgmental views on religion or anything else, it basically said, I can't tell you that, and it would be impossible to tell you that, and that kind of thing, even though the answer is pretty obvious. So they have weaknesses, but in my opinion, my humble opinion, and I think many others, it's going to become mainstream. Even years ago, Google said they were going to be an AI first company. So this is definitely a thing, and it's huge. And both Google and Bing have announced and planned integration of large language models into search already. They're just not yet fully available. So how is it going to interact with SEO? Where is SEO going to go? I've done a lot of reading on this topic already, and I will express some dissatisfaction. I don't think a lot of the articles I've read were interesting or had some really key points. And I think it's because it's a very, very emerging subject. It's so fresh. So we could take two extreme viewpoints. The one is skepticism, which is no one knows how it's going to pan out. And the other is credulity, which is we know exactly how it's going to pan out. ABC. I'd like to avoid both of those extremes in this presentation and go somewhere in the middle and say we can speculate about certain things, but ultimately we don't know absolutely for sure. I take my inspiration in my own speculation on the subject from how a historian or a lawyer might work. So when there's like a new emerging political development, a historian might say, where's the precedent? Like, has something like this happened before? And when that happened, how did it pan out? Or we know lawyers would go to previous cases to try to establish precedent. So for me, talking about how large language models are going to interact with SEO, the first thing I looked for is precedent. Has anything like this happened to search before? And how has it happened? And you may be surprised that although ChatGPT is very new, very capable, the way that it might interact with SEO as a landscape does have precedent. And I'm going to walk you through that and sort of speculate how things might be different this time, but what might also be the same. So let's talk about precedents. So large language models synthesize answers from a training data set, as we said. And so the question is, has something like this happened before, where there's this training data set, the information on the internet, and where answers are being synthesized from that? Have similar things happened in the past? And for those who are familiar with SEO, you might know what knowledge graph is. But for me, I turn to knowledge graph as an example of a precedent that we can speculate from. So let's walk back to how Google was in the beginning. You may remember that back in the early 2000s, Google looked a lot more like this, which is what we call the 10 blue links. So whenever you did a search, Google would present to you a bunch of candidates that would be the potential answer. So like here you've asked about blue links or whatever you put in, and Google says, here you go, dear user, here are a bunch of results from the web that might answer your question. That's the premise behind the search engine. So in the beginning, it was really just like a directory, just featuring different web content and ranking it based on which content might be higher quality, more relevant. But then over time, Google invented something called the knowledge graph, which is they started to extrapolate what the content of the web means. So this picture here is an example of what a knowledge graph is. A knowledge graph is entities and their relationships. So you can see here, for example, Paris is located, Tower Eiffel is located in Paris, Paris is a place, etc. Google started to piece together, and this has been happening for years already, the meanings of different things. And that allowed them to create more rich results. So if you look at Google today, it's significantly different from how it was 20 years ago. And there are various richer answers that are appearing and have already been appearing for years. And those answers are, on some level, aggregated from and synthesized from the content on the web. So two examples, we'll talk about others, but two very relevant examples is the featured snippets, the answer boxes, which we have highlighted here, and the people also ask. These are pulled straight from websites. You can see Google's done stuff like bolding certain responses. And so they have engaged with and tried to understand the content on the web and modify slightly. All of the snippets that you see, the descriptions that you see in search, are also dynamically generated from the content on the page. Sometimes Google will use the meta description that a user specifies on that page, but a lot of the time they just generate it automatically. So Google has been chopping and changing and rearranging and bolding and stuff for a long time. And in my view, ChatGPT or Google's Bard, which is coming, will just be an incremental step along that journey where the amount of synthesis, the amount of padding and addition and remixing is going to increase substantially. And so it's going to make search results a lot richer. So as an example, you could go into Google and you ask, is Justin Timberlake married? And Google understands what Justin Timberlake is a person, understands married means they have a spouse. And you can see here the knowledge graph, Justin Timberlake / spouse, Jessica Biel. And I think that is our precedent. And I think that ChatGPT is going to take that much further. So when Google started to aggregate and synthesize results and mix and mash them in search, what were some of the things they had to consider as important? Well, when the answer box first came along, one of the biggest questions Google had to face was endorsement. So they were now putting one answer in bold in a box above the others. Is that endorsement? Is Google now saying that is the answer to that question? A couple of years ago when the answer box came out, this was a very important consideration. And people were concerned that they were saying this answer is better than the others. It is the answer where the others are just possible answers. And so how did they evolve that to compensate? Don't quote me on this, but I do remember that when they were experimenting with the answer box, there might have been a time when the actual link was less obvious than this. It might have been down here or even just not there. And one of the things Google had to do to attribute the answer much better was to put it in a lot more obviously like this. That I think was part of their experimentation. So one of the ways that they got around the question of endorsement of answers is to give better attribution. If you've ever asked Siri a question, say about health, like what is bronchitis, you may notice that the answer, or Google Assistant, you may notice that the answer comes in the format of according to. So it'll say according to Mayo Clinic, blah, 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 blah. That's how Google sort of shuns, in a sense, the responsibility for the answer, saying this isn't Google's answer to the question. This is Mayo Clinic's answer to the question. One of the biggest problems Bard might have is that it might make Google more accountable for the answers that it provides, because now it's synthesizing the results. This is no longer according to Mayo Clinic. This is according to Bard. And that's going to be a significant concern for Google. And so questions will arise. What about the credibility of this information? How factual is it? If you go to ChatGPT today, you'll notice a whole list of disclaimers. It may provide false information, etc., etc., etc. These are going to be significant questions as Google starts to synthesize the responses more. Another question, which we'll get to in more detail later in the presentation, is the impact of content and the traffic ecosystem. So how did Google solve this in the past? Well, what they did is they focused on what they called EEAT. They created algorithmic methods to determine the experience, expertise, authoritativeness, and trustworthiness of content. And a lot of that has to do with the links pointing to the site, how good the links are, but then also analysis of the content on the page. When Google started to offer more medical knowledge, you'll notice if you go Google search some kind of medical condition, there's a very rich response on the right-hand side. These have been here for years. They had to put together entire committees to fact check and sanitize this data, no pun intended. So they had to make sure that the quality of the data was good, and they still have to work through a lot of that for Bard. So how's this going to impact content creators? And how did the answer box impact content creators? Well, people who are offering trivial celebrity information like who's married to who, these people lost a lot of traffic because Google was now presenting the answers directly in the search results. People who are offering deep and valuable content, something like the one that we showed here earlier, pediatric insomnia, these people, it wasn't that they lost nor won, but that a new channel called the answer box evolved. And so SEOs became concerned with how you could get into the answer box. So it became its own brand new channel to consider. And in short, I think that that's what's going to happen with ChatGPT, is it'll become its own new channel in search. So I think large language models will be similar. There will be some loss for some people, especially the thin content type of website content, but there'll be gain for other people, and there'll be evolution. And that's kind of what's happened from Precedence in every instance before when big changes have come to search. So let's turn from our Precedence now to turn about Bing's demo and learning. So Bing put together a demonstration. You can watch it on YouTube where they showed how their chat works. It's brilliant and interesting. I'm just going to give you some brief reflections from that demo. about, and tie that back to what we've been talking about with answer boxes and featured snippets. So here's an example of a search where someone said, compare the most influential Mexican artists and their top paintings. And so you could see, obviously, they still had the answer box, which is, the old thing now. And on the right-hand side, we have the synthesized response, which is from Bing's chat. But the thing that I want to note most importantly about the synthesized response is actually how it's not terribly different from the content on this page, except for that it's synthesized by Bing. If you showed this screenshot to someone who didn't know much about this, they would probably just say, look, Frigya Kahalo, instead of having a snippet that's this size, just has a snippet that's this size. And there's a link across to another article that speaks more in detail about it. And so it is very incremental. It's an evolution. It could result in slightly richer and longer snippets, but in this particular example, it doesn't seem all that different or powerful. But what I find most important to consider as a content creator and for all of us is that there is a link in here. And so Bing's early samples they gave have this attribution, have a backlink to the website, which could be a traffic source in the same way that the answer box is a traffic source. So again, in this instance, there's not much difference between the answer box and the large language model, in my view. There's some padding, there's some attribution. It might result in less clicks, but the answer boxes resulted in less clicks too. We'll go into more detail there. But I think that the more powerful examples of synthesizing are when more specific and interesting questions are asked. So here's an example that they gave. Will the IKEA Clipaddon love seat fit into my 2019 Honda Odyssey if I fold down the seats? So this is very specific and it's a bit more intelligent, where someone is asking about the dimensions of something. And you can see there it says, according to the web, the IKEA Clip-in love seat measures blah, 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 and the Honda Odyssey provides this much cargo space, so it should not fit there. It seems the love seat will not fit into the Odyssey with all seats in use, but might fit with a second and third row seats folded. This is where things will get really interesting, is synthesizing from multiple sources to answer very specific and very intelligent questions. So in these instances, it might save us as users a lot of reading and a lot of thinking time. And that is why I'm really excited. Users are going to love it, probably, and we'll get to how it affects us as content creators a bit more in detail later. So we can think of some use cases where it's going to affect content creators in good ways and bad ways. The first is a good way. So let me give you one example as a use case. Just yesterday night, I was chatting with my wife about the potential of doing guest lectures on SEO in the University of Western Australia where she works. Because I'm busy, I don't have time. I don't want to go read all of their websites about what courses they offer in marketing and digital marketing. But what I could do is I could go to Bing and I could say, please read the UWA website and tell me a bit about the digital marketing courses that they offer. And so it'll go crawl the entire website and synthesize the response in real time. That will be incredibly powerful. I could then also say, tell me about Murdoch University or tell me about Curtin. How are they different from UWA? How different are the courses? Those are instances where these tools could save us huge amounts of time in research and just generate the answer straight away. And the content creators would be happy with that. I'm pretty sure UWA doesn't mind that it's helping people engage more with the courses that the university offers. So in those instances, it's more like a personal assistant where it is just going and saving us human time. And that's one of the key visions of this technology that is coming out of all of the podcasts and stuff that the Google and such are doing, is that it will be a very powerful personal assistant. So that's great because the universities are still going to get interest in their courses. But the bad is when my organization produces content for a living. So for example, one key concern is newspapers. Or just anyone else for whom content creation is just an incredibly key part of what they do. They could synthesize responses from my website without credit, and they could not send me traffic, just like the answer box sometimes does as well. And so the key question in my mind in those instances will be, how does the chatbot connect you back to the organization? Does it do according to so-and-so, and does it encourage you to visit their website with a link? But I personally am concerned for those people. So voice search, we know this was a question years ago with Google Assistant. People are asking, what's voice search going to do with clicks through to websites? It theoretically reduces the clicks to websites because people can get the answer straight from Google Assistant or Amazon Assistant or whatever. But as we'll get into later in the presentation, the true picture is a bit more nuanced, and the pie actually grows overall anyway. So, is everyone with me so far? And are there any questions before we move on to the next topics? Does that all make sense as precedents and raising the fundamental concerns? Cool. So the way I see it is there are two ways of looking at how large language models will affect SEO, and they're sort of inverse of each other. The first is how you use the large language model as a content creator, and the second is how the search engines use large language models in the SERPs and the user experience of those. So let's start with the first one, which is content generation using large language models. So I've already used ChatGPT to generate blog articles on topics, and I found its content was generally quite good. But the question is, if I go and publish content on my website that ChatGPT wrote, what's that going to do? If you go to Google's developer documentation, in February this year, they launched an article, Google Search and AI Content. Wednesday, February the 8th, they said, quote, "When it comes to automatically generated content, our guidance has been consistent for years. Using automation, including AI, to generate content with the primary purpose of manipulating ranking in search results is a violation of our spam policies." Now, the page does say more and present a little bit more of a nuanced viewpoint, but overall, the point is Google wants real human beings who write really good quality content to be producing the content. They don't want spammy or repetitive or thin content. And if you're asking, well, how might they know? There are already, and have been for months, methods to detect ChatGPT generated content. So there's this tool, you can use it, called GPT-0, and you can just paste in content into it, and it will predict the possibility that it was generated by a large language model. And we know Google has access to these. So already I would not be surprised if Google is fairly competent at reading content on a page and detecting if it's generated by ChatGPT or similar. Now, of course, it's a cat and mouse game, because you could ask ChatGPT certain things to try and make it less detectable. Newer large language models are going to come out that might be less detectable or more human in the way that they write. But as a principle, I think we should understand that Google doesn't want automatically generated content to be ranking very highly. I have heard some instances of some websites where they are already ranking, and that's because the website itself has so much content that's human written that the GPT written content is doing okay. And so there are a lot of nuances here to discuss, but to paint a broad picture, I'd suggest don't just use the ChatGPT to write a piece and then publish it directly. Another argument in favor of that is, if you use ChatGPT or anything like that, a large language model, to generate a piece of content and publish it, you are directly competing with Bard or Bing's AI. So why would they send traffic to your automatically generated content when they could just generate the answer themselves, saving the user that click and that interaction with your website? So that is another reason why they probably wouldn't rank it. Again, I reiterate, EEAT, expertise, experience, authoritativeness, and trustworthiness. Google, it really wants to rank content written by people who know what they're talking about. So I'd suggest don't fire your copywriters just yet. But can we use it for something else? And the answer is definitely yes. ChatGPT is great for brainstorming, ideation. So you can go to it, you can ask it for ideas. I'll show you an example in a minute. And it's also great for polishing and summarizing. So I actually think, in my opinion, summarizing what competitors have written might be the most interesting one. As I described before, the use case with the University of Western Australia, what I could do to Bing pretty soon probably is I could go and say, hey, please read the content on 100 of the SEO agencies in Sydney and summarize what some of the major topics are that they're talking about. This could save people hours of reading, and it would immediately just pop out all the answers. In certain industries where there are only a handful of competitors, you'll be able to ask the AI, tell me about all the content that my competitors have written. Tell me about their website writing styles, etc., etc. Tell me, hopefully when they integrate it with SEO tools, tell me about the keywords they rank for, etc. So it'll be a tool that we can use. Here's an example. I just said to GPT, my business does SEO. I need a content strategy. Can you give me 5 blog post ideas? Boom, there are 5 ideas. They're really not bad ideas. Bear in mind that they're all from existing content. So whatever ideas it generates came from, again, back to the training data set, they came from what other people have already written. So from that perspective, there's nothing new or fresh here. It's all just old stuff. But the ideas are still pretty good and interesting ideas. Cool. So that's in a nutshell my view and suggestions about content creation using large language models. You can use them as a tool, but I wouldn't use them to write the actual content. Now the next question, which I think for me personally is more interesting, is how will Google and Bing's large language models use my content, again, in synthesizing their responses? What are you going to do? So here's, in a nutshell, the deal that we all seem to have opted in with search engines. The previous deal is we generate high quality, useful information for users. You rank what's best. You send visits to our website. We satisfy the user intent together, and the users consume the content on my website with my branding in the top, my contact us page in the top, and my email sign up form popping up to them. And so it's a win-win situation. Google satisfies the user's intent, I get the visits, and they consume it on my terms. And we're all happy. There's a content ecosystem. There's a codependent relationship with Google. The problem and concern with large language models, of course, is, as I've described, we generate the content, you, Google, scrape the content, you made synthesized answers to that, and you answer the questions directly. The users never make it to my website. This looks like a win-lose, and this is the premise from which we'll work in discussing how this could pan out. So some people are already unhappy with this because creatives don't like stealing. So again, looking for precedence, any of you have kept up with the image model AIs, so not Google, not large language models, but image generation AIs, there are already lawsuits where image libraries like Getty Images or artists are suing the image AIs for scraping their content. So you can read the headlines, but the idea is that, again, the training data set that this image generator AI used came from other people. They put an effort to generate this beautiful training data set in whatever way, and it's now just using it to immediately produce content just like that. There's a really interesting article here. Artist and visual media companies sue AI image generator for copyright breach. So here's the artists some of the artists that are suing these AIs. And why are they suing them? Well, if you spend 30 years of your art career creating a unique, distinctive artistic style, and people pay you money to use that style, now these image AIs are able to generate fresh, very convincing images using your style. So you can actually go to the image AI and say, please use the style of Sarah Anderson to create a landscape drawing or whatever it is. And they're actually creating very, very convincing replicas of these artists in their style, unique and brand new. So this, whatever happens with these legal cases, I think is going to set the tone for AI in potentially years and decades to come, because this is really concerning for these artists. And now bringing it back to SEO, again, content creators, organizations like newspapers, they're going to be very concerned because they pay journalists to generate this content about what's happening in the world. And Google might just say, you might go to Google and say, tell me about some of the top headlines today. And Google is just like, boom, 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 boom. There are your headlines. They've already been doing that in many ways, but now there's less likelihood that people will click through to the actual newspaper. Also, people who run blogs who have ads on the side and monetize through those ads, those would be a concern. Will they ransack the content ecosystem? Well, firstly, in AU, in Australia, we know that there's precedent. We know that media organizations have been concerned about the way Google and other organizations use their news without sending visitors to them that will click on the ads. For example, if you ask Siri, good morning, tell me a bit about the news, Siri will just answer you immediately with the latest news without getting you to click and look at an ad. We know that the Aussie government in 2021 started making Google pay newspapers for using their content. So this, I think in Australia, we actually have good precedent that we won't just let them get away with it. How about in the US and overseas, around the world? Very interesting, very fresh. There was a New York Times a Hard Fork podcast episode just on March 31st with Google's CEO, Sundar Pichai, where they interviewed him and they asked him some of these fundamental questions about Bard, AI, etc. I listened to the interview, and specifically they asked him about what about our ad revenue. And his response is, we're very conscious of the content ecosystem, it'll shift. But his other claim, which I think is fair, is that it'll also grow. So the pie itself might get bigger. What we've seen in the evolution of search is that every time Google invents these new things that actually do result in 0 clicks, they also make the entire pie grow larger. So I have a couple of graphs to show you that. So, for example, let me just go down to this one first. 0-click searches. A 0-click search is when someone does a search, as the name implies, in Google, but doesn't click through to any of the results. They get the answer straight from the page. You can see here that 0-click searches have been trending upwards for a long time as Google's results have become richer and richer. Already, according to this graph, in September 18, it was 61%. And now, as of 2020, that's already a few years ago, it's 64%. So we see that the 0-click searches keep trending up, and only 33% of the searches, even before Bard, were resulting in clicks through to websites. We've known this for a long time. If you use any standard industry tools, you'll see, for example, here's Car Hire Sydney in Ahrefs, and there's this metric clicks per search 1.15. That's a guess of, for every searcher who searches the word Car Hire Sydney, how many times do they actually click in the result. You'll see some keywords that have very high volume that have clicks per search of like 0.0 something, because the answer is already there on the page. So again, this is a previously existing trend. It's not new, but what's fascinating is how it might make search itself grow even bigger. So every time something like this happens, we see that Google just as a beast gets bigger and bigger every time. So here's a graph, for example, showing the number of search queries growing. This is a little bit old. I couldn't pull a newer one, but Google just keeps getting huger. And so what's really difficult to predict is exactly which way it'll run. We have two opposing factors. The one is that people are going to probably click less to actual search results. But then the other is that more people will be doing searches and using these tools more. You might do 5 Google searches a day now, but you might do 15 or 20 when you have Bard with you. So how does that actually run? They're both sort of going in opposition with each other. So my prediction is it's very likely large language models will continue the trend of 0-click searches and search growth itself. In addition, just another thing to predict here, users will still need to connect with real-world organizations to help them solve their real-world problems. And I think Bard will shape that. So it'll probably shape the informational queries and transactional queries. And I'll get to that with some use cases now. So informational queries. An informational query is when someone's looking for information, obviously. And in future, what I predict is that informational queries will be affected the most, just like answer boxes affected informational queries the most and the soonest. Again, don't automatically assume no click-throughs, but do be prepared for 0 clicks to happen. Complex answers might result in more clicks, where simple answers probably will have less. And I still also want to say that it's still likely that people will click through. If you write a really good piece of content on a topic, it's really credible, it's still probably going to be the case where the chat will say, according to so-and-so, and then it'll summarize your article, and then it'll say, do you want to read more, or you can click through to read more. Now, what's really interesting is how this might affect transactional queries. So transactional query, of course, is when someone's looking to buy something. And what I see happening, and I'm personally very excited for, is that I reckon that Bard and similar large language models will become like an assistant. And so there'll be a shift of the conversation. Let me give an example. When I Google search car hire Sydney, I pick a result and then I read through the page. But in the future, it'll probably be a conversation. So I might say to Bard, my wife and I are planning a trip to Sydney soon and would like to hire a car. Can you tell us about some of the options we have? It's probably going to synthesize a lot of the results from the pages. It's going to say Hertz has these cars, Bayswater Car Rental has these cars, whatever. And then we'll talk back to it and we'll say, I really like the sound of the Hertz cars. Are there any available on these days? And then it will probably be able to pull from the website the availability of the cars. And at some point, probably not in the too far future, it'll be able to do the entire booking. So you'll be able to say to it like, hey, okay, please book the Hertz car from the 27th to the 31st. And it will probably be able to run all of your personal details and your credit card and everything through the system. That's my prediction of where that's going to go. And so in the present, the SEO conversation is, how do I rank for the keyword car hire Sydney? And how do I present a great user experience to the user? Whereas in the future, the question will be, how do I get onto Bard? How do I get Bard to know that we offer car hires? How do we present our information about the availability of the cars and the dates that they're available in a way that Bard can understand, and so that we get into the race when the user asks Bard about which car hire options are available or are cheapest or are X, right? So when that entire conversation has happened, the question is, how do I feature in that conversation? And so SEO will probably shift more to that, and we'll be researching how to get into that. And I actually think many of the principles will be the same. Cool. So that, in my view, is the predictions for the future for both informational and transactional queries. For the rest of the webinar, I have some other considerations to mention, but before we go to that, I'm wondering if anyone has any questions or comments about anything that's been covered so far. Cool. All good. Nothing. We'll move on. Cool. Thanks. So, other considerations. So, coming into the future, what else is there to consider? We've sort of walked through a lot of the user experience and content creation and such, but where else could things go? And what else is there to be aware of? The first thing I want to say is large language models are extremely heavy on computing resources. If you've been using ChatGPT, you've probably noticed that it's down sometimes, not available, that it's offering a premium membership for people who want to use it and be more exclusive. One of the reasons why Google and Bing are so successful is that on a computing level, they are lean and fast. They generate their results extremely quickly in fractions of a second. Scale is likely to be a big issue when these things take off. how do we synthesize responses so quickly for so many people? That's going to be a huge, huge consideration. And because of that, I don't see this taking off all at once. Right now, things are still in testing phases, and you can opt into a waiting list, but I don't think they can just immediately roll it out. Maybe in the short or medium term, there'll be a click to chat option, which is that when you do a search, it doesn't automatically synthesize the response from the AI, but you have to click explicitly to initiate a chat, and that will save them computing resources. It may never be default, depending on how these organizations solve the computer resources problem. The next, of course, which I actually didn't add a slide here, but I'm going to comment on anyway, is the advertising revenue models. That's a ball that both Google and Bing will most certainly keep their eyes on, which is when we are now synthesizing responses from the web for all of these things, how are we going to make money? Are there going to be two bards, where one bard is the organic bard and one bard is the paid bard, where you pay to get in, just like you pay to get into Google Ads? These will be very, very significant questions. And since search is one of the most profitable businesses in the world and profitable branches of computer science, I don't think Google is just going to drop it. They are going to have to work very, very hard to figure out how to basically not eat their own tail when they launch this. So watch this space and we'll see what happens there. Another interesting thing is opting out. So, we're talking about these lawsuits that are happening where people don't want Google to use their content. I predict that it's going to be very likely that you'll be able to opt out of Google using your website in its training data set. Probably the training data set is the web itself, or at least the portion of the web that's high enough quality that Google is wanting to use it. So probably mechanisms like robots.txt or meta robots will still be useful to opt out. And I predict that maybe one day Google will say, if you don't want us to synthesize responses from your website, exclude yourself from robots.txt. But people won't do it, because in the same reason that you don't do it today, it would be suicide for SEO to exclude your website from robots.txt, because you want to be featured. And when users are using Bard to answer the questions, you'll want to be one of the answers that Bard provides. But I think opting out will be possible. And then finally, just some reflections on alarmism. So there's obviously, when new technology comes along, there's obviously a lot of fear. There's some excitement too about what could happen, but a lot of speculation. But to speak to the fear, I don't think there's reason to be alarmed just yet. We know a couple of years ago, I don't know if any of you remember this, but does anyone remember Google Glass, when Google was producing this pair of glasses that you can wear that's tied into Google Assistant and it can do all sorts of stuff? They spent a lot of money developing this technology, and they started to sell it back in 2013. I still remember seeing a dude from Google coming the first time I saw Google Glass in 2014. But now there's nothing. Glass is absolutely dead. It was a flop. It didn't work out. Now, I'm not saying that ChatGPT or Bard will be a flop. I absolutely don't think so. But the point is that new and sexy technology can come along and we can get very worked up about it. And then how it actually pans out is totally different from what we expect. So Glass, there were even laws created to protect privacy and stuff. People were really preparing for Glass to take off, and it didn't take off. So again, I think GPT will take off, but how it pans out is still very, very open-ended. So we don't know how it'll evolve. People will still continue to use search engines to organize the world's information and connect with organizations that solve their problems. A few or even many of the subtle details will shift. But again, in summary, I think the conversation for SEO in the future will be how to get your content to rank higher in the list of Bard responses. People have said many times before that SEO is dead. Even a decade ago, when I started working in SEO, people were saying it was dead because certain types of spam no longer worked. And I think most likely SEO will just ride the wave of BARD and large language models and continue to evolve. And SEOs like me will continue to upskill and try to understand how to get content to rank in it and how it's working. And I think there's a lot to be excited about. Cool. Thank you very much. So I'm just going to leave it open in case there are any questions or comments, and that's the presentation.